The train station was eerily quiet that night, the kind of silence that swallowed even the faintest echoes of distant footsteps. Jenna pulled her coat tighter around her as a cold wind swept through the empty platform. Her train, the 11:45 to Albany, was delayed, a rare occurrence for this route. She checked the illuminated sign overhead again. Delayed, new arrival time, 12:15 a.m. Great. As she sat on the cold metal bench, she noticed how the fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently. The sound of the flickering bulbs was the only noise in the station now. She shivered, but not entirely from the cold. There was something about the emptiness, the stillness, that made her uneasy. She glanced at her phone. No signal, of course. Moments later, the rumble of an approaching train broke the silence. Jenna stood, relieved, though the train's arrival was oddly sudden. The headlights pierced through the darkness, growing larger as the train slowed to a stop. Its exterior was an older model, worn with peeling paint and windows clouded with grime. She hadn't seen this kind of train in years. The doors slid open with a metallic screech, and the dim light inside cast an unsettling yellow glow on the empty carriages. Hesitant, Jenna stepped aboard. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. She looked around. Not a single passenger occupied the long rows of seats. The train felt colder than the platform, and she hugged herself as she moved further down the aisle. With a jolt, the doors slammed shut, and the train lurched forward. She chose a seat near the middle of the car and sat down, trying to shake the strange unease creeping over her. She told herself the train was just an old model, likely pulled out of retirement for some emergency. Yet something about it felt wrong. The seats were covered in faded, threadbare fabric. The overhead compartments were dusty, as if they hadn't been used in decades. The train picked up speed, the sound of the wheels against the track growing louder, almost deafening. Jenna's phone buzzed faintly in her pocket. She pulled it out, her relief short-lived when she saw the screen. A single notification flashed. "Do not look out the window." Her pulse quickened. She stared at the message, her mind racing to rationalize it. A glitch? A prank? She glanced at the window beside her, the inky blackness of the outside world reflecting her pale face. Something in her gut told her not to turn her head fully, not to focus too hard. But curiosity gnawed at her. Another buzz. This time the message read, "It sees you." Her breath hitched. She shoved the phone back into her pocket and stared straight ahead. The overhead lights began to dim, flickering in time with the rhythmic clatter of the train. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She wasn't alone anymore. She could feel it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, like a shadow settling over her. The train car groaned, as if under strain. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement in the window's reflection. Just a faint blur. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Don't look! Don't look!" The lights flickered out completely, like plunging the car into darkness. Jenna's breathing grew shallow as she gripped the edges of her seat. The train continued to barrel forward, the sound of the wheels on the track now mingled with something else, a low, guttural growl. The lights blinked back on. The car was no longer empty. Figures sat in the seats, their heads bowed, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. Jenna's chest tightened as she scanned the car, her eyes darting from one figure to the next. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice caught in her throat. Her phone buzzed again. Trembling, she pulled it out and read the message. "Do not speak to them." One of the figures stirred, its head tilted slightly, as if it had heard her thoughts. Jenna froze, every muscle in her body locked in terror. The figure slowly turned its head toward her, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, just a void where features should have been. Jenna clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The train jolted violently and she was thrown from her seat, landing hard on the floor. When she looked up, the figures were gone. The car was empty again, but the oppressive feeling remained. The lights dimmed and the train began to slow, the screech of the brakes echoing through the car. It came to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Jenna peered out the window despite every instinct screaming at her not to. The train sat on a track suspended above a black abyss, the world outside devoid of stars or moonlight. She couldn't even tell if there was ground below. The doors hissed open. A cold wind rushed in, carrying with it a sound that made her blood run cold. A chorus of whispers, soft and unintelligible, yet somehow beckoning. She stayed frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest. Then, slowly, a shadow began to form at the far end of the car. It crept forward, growing taller, darker, more solid with every passing second. Jenna scrambled to her feet, backing away toward the other end of the car. The shadow moved unnaturally, its edges writhing like smoke. Her phone buzzed once more. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. The message read, "Run." She turned and bolted down the aisle, her footsteps echoing as she sprinted through the connecting doors into the next car. It was identical to the first, empty, cold, and unsettling. She didn't stop, didn't look back. She kept running, each car blending into the next, as if the train were endless. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadow was chasing her, its presence pressing closer. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. She flung open another door and stumbled into a car that was different. This one was pristine, brightly lit, and completely silent. In the center of the car sat a conductor, his back to her. Relief flooded her as she approached him, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me. Something's on this train." The conductor turned slowly. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed faintly. He smiled, but the expression was devoid of warmth. "You shouldn't have gotten on this train," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "It doesn't stop for the living." Jenna's blood ran cold as the lights flickered again. When they came back on, the conductor was gone. She was alone, standing in the middle of the endless train. The last thing she heard was the screech of brakes and the sound of the whispers enveloping her completely. The train plunged into darkness, and Jenna was never seen again.
Story number 2.
The train pulled into the station just as the clock struck midnight. Lucas had been waiting alone on the platform for nearly an hour. The surrounding town was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of distant streetlights and the occasional rustling of leaves. The train was an older model, its exterior battered and streaked with grime, and its windows were too dark to see inside. He hesitated before boarding. This wasn't the train he usually took, but the schedule said it was headed to his destination. He stepped on, the metallic clunk of his boots echoing unnaturally loud in the empty car. The doors slid shut behind him with a hiss, and the train jolted forward, moving faster than he expected. Lucas chose a seat near the center of the car and settled in, trying to shake the chill that seemed to permeate the air. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a flickering yellow glow. There were no other passengers, though he thought he'd seen a shadow flicker at the edge of his vision as he boarded. The train's interior was strange, old-fashioned, yet not quite fitting any specific era. The seats were upholstered in dark green velvet, fraying at the edges, and the walls were lined with tarnished brass fixtures. It smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic like rusted iron. Lucas tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but the screen showed no service. Frustrated, he stuffed it back in his pocket and stared out the window. The night outside was pitch black, the countryside rushing past in a blur. He couldn't see any landmarks, no towns or streetlights, just endless darkness. The first noise came suddenly, breaking the monotonous clatter of the wheels on the track. It was a low groan, like metal bending under immense pressure. Lucas glanced up, scanning the empty car, but saw nothing out of place. The sound grew louder, a scraping, grinding noise that seemed to come from beneath the train. He shifted uncomfortably, his pulse quickening. Then the lights flickered. When they steadied, he noticed something odd. There were now dark stains on the floor, leading down the aisle and out of sight. They looked like smudges of oil at first, but as he stared, he realized they were deep red. Blood. Lucas stood, his breathing shallow, and followed the trail. It led to the door connecting the cars. He hesitated, pressing his ear against the cold metal. For a moment, he thought he heard faint whispers, too muffled to make out. Gathering his courage, he slid the door open and stepped into the next car. This one was completely dark, save for the dim emergency lighting along the floor. The smell hit him first, a sickly sweet stench that turned his stomach. His footfalls squelched against the floor, and when he looked down, he saw that the stains had spread, covering the entire aisle in a sticky, dark sludge. The whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from every direction, layering over one another in an incomprehensible chorus. Lucas turned slowly, his heart pounding, and froze when he saw a figure at the far end of the car. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and wrong, as if its joints had been bent backwards. Its face, or what should have been its face, was obscured by a veil of darkness that seemed to move on its own, writhing like smoke. It stood perfectly still, but its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging his presence. Lucas backed away, his eyes locked on the figure. As he did, the train lurched violently, throwing him against the wall. The lights flickered again, and the figure was suddenly closer, standing just a few feet away. Its arms stretched out toward him, the fingers impossibly long, tipped with jagged black nails. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and Lucas bolted. He ran blindly through the train, flinging open door after door, each car more distorted than the last. In one, the seats were piled high with old, rotting luggage. In another, the windows showed not darkness, but a swirling void of gray, filled with shadowy shapes that seemed to press against the glass. Finally, he stumbled into a car that appeared normal, brightly lit, clean, and empty. He collapsed into a seat, gasping for air, and buried his face in his hands. The train slowed, the screech of the brakes signaling a stop. He looked up, relieved to see the faint outline of a station platform through the window. As the train came to a halt, the doors slid open. He didn't hesitate, sprinting out onto the platform. The air was cold, the ground slick with moisture. But something was wrong. The station was completely unfamiliar. An ancient, crumbling structure with no signs or lights, surrounded by an impenetrable fog. He turned back toward the train, but it was gone. The tracks stretched endlessly into the mist, empty. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from the fog itself. A chill ran down his spine as the shadows began to move, coalescing into figures just like the one he'd seen on the train. Lucas ran, the sound of his footsteps drowned out by the whispers. He didn't know where he was going, but the fog thickened, the figures drawing closer with every step. The last thing he heard was a voice, low and guttural, whispering in his ear, "You were never meant to leave." And then there was only silence.
Story number 3.
The train arrived at exactly 3 a.m., the only sound breaking the quiet of the isolated rural station. The headlights pierced through the thick fog, illuminating the desolate platform where Aaron stood, clutching his duffel bag. He didn't remember why he'd agreed to take such a late train, but he was here now, and there was no going back. The train was old, its exterior rusted and streaked with grime. Aaron hesitated as the doors opened with a groan, releasing a cold gust of air that smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. He stepped aboard, the doors hissing shut behind him. The interior was dimly lit, the seats worn and discolored, their original color impossible to determine. There were no other passengers, and the air was unnervingly still. Aaron chose a seat by the window, setting his bag down beside him. The train lurched forward, the wheels clattering against the rails. He glanced out the window, but the fog was so dense he couldn't see anything beyond it. The world outside seemed to dissolve into a void, and it made him uneasy. As the train sped up, Aaron noticed how silent it was. No muffled conversations, no rustling newspapers, not even the sound of a conductor making announcements. He tried to shake off the unease, telling himself it was just the late hour and the isolation playing tricks on his mind. But then he saw it. Movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, scanning the empty rows of seats. Nothing. His reflection in the window stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed. He chuckled nervously and rubbed his temples. "Get it together," he muttered under his breath. Minutes passed. The lights in the car began to flicker, the buzzing overhead growing louder. Aaron's nerves were fraying. He glanced down the aisle and froze. At the far end of the car stood a figure, half shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong, its arms too long, its neck craned at an unnatural angle. The figure didn't move, but Aaron felt its gaze, cold and piercing, even though its face was obscured. He blinked, and it was gone. His heart raced as he scanned the car again, but it was empty. "Just tired," he whispered to himself. "It's late, and I'm seeing things." The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes reverberating through the car. He leaned toward the window, but the fog was impenetrable. The train came to a halt, and the doors slid open. No station, no platform, just a wall of thick, swirling fog. Aaron sat frozen in his seat, his grip on the armrest tightening. No one boarded. The doors remained open, and the cold air seeped in, carrying with it a faint whispering sound. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, beckoning. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to stand, to step out into the fog, but he fought against it, his chest tightening with dread. The doors slammed shut and the train lurched forward again, faster this time. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the car. Aaron's unease grew as the whispers didn't fade. They grew louder, merging into a chorus that seemed to come from all directions. And then the smell hit him. It was rancid, a nauseating mix of decay and something acrid. He covered his nose, his stomach churning. The aisle was no longer empty. Dark stains spread across the floor, trailing toward him. He stared in horror as the stains began to bubble, rising into shapes, twisted, grotesque figures that writhed and crawled. The whispers became screams. Aaron leapt from his seat, backing away from the advancing figures. He ran toward the next car, flinging the door open and slamming it shut behind him. This car was worse. The seats were slashed open, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. The windows were cracked, and through them he saw not fog, but faces. Hundreds of them pressed against the glass, their mouths moving soundlessly. The train jolted violently, and Aaron was thrown to the floor. When he looked up, he saw the first figure again, standing in the middle of the aisle, its head tilted as if observing him. Its face was blank, featureless, yet he felt its eyes boring into him. "Stop!" he screamed, scrambling to his feet. "Leave me alone!" The figure took a step forward, its limbs bending unnaturally. Aaron stumbled backward, his hands clawing at the door to the next car. He managed to open it and fell through, slamming it shut behind him. This car was different. It was pristine, brightly lit, and completely silent. At the far end of the car sat a young girl in a white dress. She was turned away from him, her long, dark hair falling over her shoulders. Relief flooded through him at the sight of another person. "Hey!" he called out, his voice shaky. "Are you okay? What's going on?" The girl didn't respond. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing. As he got closer, he realized her hair wasn't hair at all. It was a writhing mass of black tendrils. She turned suddenly, and Aaron's scream caught in his throat. Her face was a void, a swirling abyss that seemed to pull at him, drawing him in. The lights went out, the train screeched to a halt, and Aaron was engulfed in darkness. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and he felt hands, cold, clawed hands, grabbing him, pulling him down into the void. When the train arrived at the next station, it was empty. The conductor stepped aboard, glanced around, and muttered under his breath. Another one lost. The doors closed, and the train disappeared into the fog.
Story number 4.
The train station was deserted, shrouded in an unnatural quiet that made Lily uneasy. She had missed the last regular train and was relieved when an unlisted midnight train unexpectedly pulled in, its arrival announced by a low, mournful whistle. The train was massive, its sleek black exterior gleaming under the flickering station lights. The conductor didn't emerge, and there were no other passengers boarding. The doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit interior. Lily hesitated before stepping in, her suitcase dragging behind her. She had no other option. Waiting for morning wasn't safe in this part of town. Inside, the air felt heavy, almost damp. The seats were upholstered in dark red fabric, pristine but oddly outdated, like something from another era. She chose a seat near the middle of the car, setting her suitcase at her feet. The train started moving almost immediately, and the view outside the window dissolved into pitch-black darkness. There were no lights, no towns, just an infinite void. Lily settled into her seat, clutching her phone, but it had no signal. She frowned, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up her spine. The train was eerily silent except for the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks. She noticed there were no advertisements on the walls, no announcements over the speakers, and no sign of any staff or other passengers. She was alone, or so she thought. The first sign of something wrong came about 15 minutes in. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Lily looked up, startled, and thought she saw movement in the reflection of the glass. She turned quickly, but the car was empty. The lights stabilized, but the sense of unease lingered. Then the train slowed, the screech of brakes reverberating through the car. Lily peered out the window, but there was no station, no platform, just more darkness. The doors opened anyway, letting in a rush of freezing air that carried a faint, acrid smell. No one got on. No one got off. The doors closed and the train picked up speed again, but something had changed. The air grew colder, her breath now visible in the dim light. She pulled her coat tighter around her, glancing nervously at the empty seats. The fabric seemed darker than before, almost wet, and the metallic smell intensified. A soft noise made her freeze. It was faint at first, a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct, a woman's voice, weeping. Lily turned, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her, growing louder and more anguished. "Hello?" Lily called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The weeping stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so oppressive it felt like a weight on her chest. She stood, gripping the back of her seat for support, and looked down the aisle. At the far end of the car, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown. Her face was obscured by her long, matted hair, and she moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if her joints didn't work properly. The woman's head tilted up slightly, and though Lily couldn't see her eyes, she felt their weight, sharp and penetrating. Lily backed away, her breaths coming in short gasps. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman didn't answer. She took another step forward, her movements creating a horrible, bone-crunching sound. The lights flickered again, plunging the car into momentary darkness. When they came back, the woman was closer. Lily turned and ran, sprinting down the aisle and into the next car. This one was completely different. Dark, with shattered windows and seats that were torn and covered in dark stains. The smell of decay hit her like a wall, and she gagged, her eyes watering. The train jolted violently, throwing her to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, looking back toward the door she'd come through, but the woman was gone. Or so she thought. A hand, cold and skeletal, grabbed her ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly, and broke free, running deeper into the train. The weeping started again, louder this time, echoing through the empty cars. She felt like she was being pulled deeper into a nightmare. The next car was worse. The walls were covered in scratched words written in what looked like blood. "No escape! No escape! No escape!" The whispers returned, mingling with the cries, forming a cacophony that made her head throb. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, but when she turned, there was nothing. Desperate, Lily threw open another door and stumbled into a car that was brightly lit and clean. It looked normal, and for a moment, hope flared in her chest. But then she saw them, passengers. They sat silently in their seats, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow and lifeless. She approached one, a man in a business suit, and touched his shoulder. His head snapped toward her, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The others turned too, all of them staring at her with empty eyes. The train screeched to a halt, and the lights went out completely. Lily felt hands grabbing her, pulling her back, their icy touch burning her skin. She screamed, struggling against them, but there were too many. When she woke, she was back on the platform where she'd started. The train was gone, and the station was empty. Her suitcase was nowhere to be found. Disoriented, she staggered out onto the street, but the world outside was different. Dark, cold, and silent. The buildings were crumbling, the streets deserted. She looked up at the sky, but there were no stars, no moon, only darkness. In the distance, she heard it, the low, mournful whistle of a train. And she realized with chilling certainty that it was coming back for her.
Story number 5.
The train pulled into the station at 12:15 a.m., exactly on time, as it always did. Danny waited on the platform, clutching his ticket tightly in his hand. He was the only person there, save for the shadows that seemed to deepen unnaturally under the dim station lights. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for an early spring night. The train itself was strange. An antique model with polished brass fixtures and ornate detailing like something out of a history book. It looked out of place, and yet no one ever questioned it. Danny certainly didn't. He just wanted to get home. The doors opened with a low groan, and he stepped inside. The interior was even more lavish than the exterior, with plush red seats, mahogany paneling, and old-fashioned lanterns swaying gently from hooks on the ceiling. It was empty. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender and something else, a metallic tang that he couldn't quite place. The train began to move before he could sit down, the doors sliding shut with a soft hiss. Danny chose a seat near the middle of the car and glanced out the window. The town he knew so well disappeared into the night, replaced by a thick, impenetrable fog. As the train sped up, Danny realized there were no familiar stops. The usual route would pass several small towns, but there was only darkness outside, an endless void. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. The screen glowed dimly, casting eerie shadows across his face. Then he noticed the first oddity. The lanterns hanging from the ceiling began to sway more violently, as though the train was moving over uneven tracks. Yet the ride felt smooth. The soft hum of the train was now accompanied by a distant sound, faint at first, but growing louder, a rhythmic tapping like someone walking down the aisle. Danny turned, expecting to see someone behind him, but the car was empty. The tapping continued, echoing unnaturally. It wasn't footsteps, he realized. It was coming from above. His gaze shot to the ceiling. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved across the frosted glass panel above him. His breath caught in his throat. The shadow paused directly above his seat, lingering there before vanishing. The train lurched suddenly, throwing Danny against the window. He groaned, rubbing his shoulder, and stood to steady himself. The tapping was gone, but the silence that followed was worse. It was a deep, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow every other sound. He decided to move to another car. Grabbing his bag, he slid open the door at the end of the aisle and stepped through. The connecting passage was narrow and dark, lit only by a flickering bulb. As he reached for the door to the next car, he heard it again, the tapping, this time behind him. Danny spun around, his heart racing. A figure stood in the shadows at the far end of the car he'd just left. It was tall, impossibly thin, and cloaked in black. Its head tilted slightly as if studying him. Danny didn't wait to see more. He yanked the door open and stumbled into the next car, slamming it shut behind him. This car was different. The seats were torn, the fabric shredded and oozing a dark, viscous liquid. The windows were cracked, and the air was heavy with the smell of rot. Danny gagged, covering his nose and mouth. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. It echoed back to him, distorted and hollow. He moved quickly, making his way down the aisle. The lanterns in this car were dim, their light casting jagged shadows that seemed to move. He passed a row of seats and froze. Someone was sitting there, hunched over at their back to him. "Hey," Danny said, his voice a mix of fear and relief. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. He took a hesitant step closer. "Hello?" The person turned, and Danny stumbled back. Their face was gaunt, the skin stretched tightly over their skull. Their eyes were empty sockets, and their mouth hung open in a silent scream. The train jolted again, and the figure disappeared, leaving only the faint impression of its form in the seat. Danny's chest tightened. He ran to the end of the car, throwing open the next door without looking back. The next car was darker still, the windows completely blacked out. He fumbled forward, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The tapping returned, louder now and closer. He broke into a run, desperate to find an escape. He reached another door, but when he opened it, he found himself back in the first car. The plush seats, the lanterns, and the faint lavender scent. All the same. His suitcase was still by the seat he'd originally chosen. "No," he whispered, backing away. "No, this isn't right." The tapping grew deafening, coming from every direction. The shadows in the car began to twist and writhe, forming shapes, faces and hands that reached for him. He stumbled backward, tripping over his suitcase and landing hard on the floor. The train screeched to a stop. The doors opened, revealing nothing but an endless void of swirling darkness. The air grew colder, and the shadows closed in around him. As the lanterns flickered and dimmed, Danny heard a voice, soft and whispering, just above the sound of his pounding heart. "You shouldn't have boarded." The train pulled away from the station, leaving behind only an eerie silence, and Danny was never seen again.
Story number 6.
The train arrived at Platform 6, its headlights piercing through the thick fog that clung to the old station. The locomotive was unlike anything Kara had seen before. Ancient, with rusted metal plates and an unsettling, almost organic look to its rivets. It hissed as it came to a halt, and the heavy iron doors opened with a groan that echoed through the empty station. Kara hesitated. She had planned to take the last train home, but her usual platform had been closed for maintenance, and the attendant had directed her here. She didn't recall seeing this platform before, but it wasn't the time to be picky. The streets were dangerous at night, and she had no other way to get home. Stepping aboard, she noticed how cold it was inside, colder than outside. The air seemed to sap the warmth from her body immediately. The interior was dimly lit, with only a few flickering bulbs casting weak light over cracked leather seats. There were no other passengers. She sat near the middle, clutching her bag, and tried to ignore the faint smell of decay that lingered in the air. The train lurched forward, and Kara watched as the fog outside swallowed the station. The windows were soon filled with darkness, the kind that seemed to press against the glass as if alive. She glanced around the car. There were no ads, no safety signs, nothing but the bare walls and the occasional scratch marks etched into the metal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, relieved to have some distraction. But the screen only displayed a single notification. Warning, stay seated. Kara frowned. She hadn't set up any app with such alerts. She looked closer, but the screen went black before she could investigate further. No signal. No battery. Nothing. Unease crept into her chest. The train slowed and came to a halt. She peered out the window but saw nothing. No station, no platform, not even tracks. Yet, the doors slid open. The cold intensified, and a shadow seemed to shift just beyond the threshold. No one boarded, and the doors closed again with a soft thud. The train resumed its journey, picking up speed. The lights flickered, and Kara felt an odd vibration in the floor beneath her feet, as if something large and heavy was crawling along the undercarriage. She shivered and hugged her bag tighter. Then came the whispers. They started faint, barely audible over the hum of the train. Kara couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. She looked around, but the car was still empty. The whispers grew louder, layered voices overlapping until they became a chorus of desperation. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. The lights flickered violently, and for a brief moment she saw them. Faces. Dozens of pale, disfigured faces pressed against the windows, mouths open in silent screams, eyes hollow and staring. They vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving Kara trembling in her seat. The train stopped again. This time, the doors opened to reveal a stretch of forest bathed in a sickly green light. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches gnarled and claw-like. Something moved between the trunks. Tall, lanky figures with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. They didn't step closer, but Kara felt their gaze pierce through her. The doors didn't close. "Leave," a voice whispered directly into her ear. Kara shot out of her seat, spinning around. No one was there. The lights dimmed further, and the figures outside moved closer, their long limbs cracking as they stretched toward the train. The whispers returned, louder, angrier. "Leave!" The voice boomed, shaking the car. Kara bolted for the next car, her heart pounding. She shoved open the door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. This car was worse. The seats were torn open, stuffing spilling out like entrails. The walls were covered in deep scratches and words scrawled in what looked like blood. "Too late. It's here." The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. She heard it now, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Kara turned and saw something at the far end of the car. It was massive, hunched over, with long arms that ended in claws. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its glowing eyes locked onto her. It lunged. Kara screamed and dove into the next car, slamming the door shut behind her. She didn't stop, running through car after car, each one more horrifying than the last. One was filled with mannequins, their heads twisted at impossible angles. Another was submerged in ankle-deep water, the walls dripping with some black tar-like substance. She finally reached the front of the train. The control room door was ajar, and she stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The room was empty, the controls rusted and broken. Through the windshield, she saw the tracks end abruptly, leading into a swirling vortex of darkness. The growl was right behind her. She turned to see the creature standing in the doorway, its form impossibly large, filling the space with its presence. It grinned, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The train plunged into the vortex and everything went black. When Kara awoke, she was back on platform 6. The station was quiet, the fog thicker than before. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw the same notification. Warning, stay seated. The train was gone, but the sound of its whistle echoed in the distance. She knew it would come back because it always did.
Story number 7.
The train screeched to a stop at the forgotten station deep in the woods, a place where no passengers ever seemed to board or disembark. The station wasn't on any map, and its name, if it had one, was long worn away from the rusted sign. Ethan had no choice but to get off. He had fallen asleep on the late-night train and missed his stop, waking up just as the conductor announced that this was the final destination. The air outside was bitterly cold, and the trees surrounding the station loomed like skeletal sentinels. The train hissed behind him as if exhaling a sigh of relief. its doors closing with an ominous finality. It pulled away, leaving Ethan standing alone on the crumbling platform. He looked around. The station was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. A single lamppost flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. Beyond the platform, a narrow gravel path wound its way into the dense forest. With no other option, Ethan decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a road or some sign of civilization. The path was uneven, lined with jagged rocks and overgrown weeds. As he walked, he became acutely aware of the sound of his own footsteps. But then, another sound joined them, soft, deliberate steps just behind him. He stopped and turned, but the path was empty. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. No response, just the wind and the faint rustling of leaves. He quickened his pace, but the footsteps persisted, matching his every move. Sometimes they seemed closer, other times farther away, but they never stopped. Panic began to creep in, and he broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The path abruptly ended at a clearing. In the center stood an old train car, its metal exterior corroded and covered in vines. It was as though it had been abandoned there for decades. The windows were dark, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. Ethan hesitated, but heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, this time circling him. With no other choice, he climbed into the train car. Inside, it was pitch black, the air stale and suffocating. He fumbled for his phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the interior. The seats were torn and rotting, and the walls were covered in graffiti-like symbols that seemed ancient, almost ritualistic. A low groan echoed through the car, and Ethan froze. It sounded like metal twisting under pressure, followed by a faint whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Get out," it hissed. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment Ethan saw a figure standing at the far end of the car, a tall silhouette with unnaturally long limbs and glowing eyes. It was there for only a second before the light went out completely. He scrambled backward, tripping over a broken seat and falling hard onto the floor. The whispering grew louder, joined by a cacophony of strange, guttural sounds. The air seemed to pulse, and the train car began to tremble. "Get out!" the voice roared, deafening now. Ethan bolted for the door, stumbling out into the clearing. The train car groaned behind him, just as its metal shell bending and contorting as if something inside was trying to break free. He didn't wait to find out. He ran back down the path, the forest seeming darker and more twisted than before. The footsteps followed him, louder and more chaotic. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he ran, but he didn't dare slow down. The path seemed endless, stretching on with no sign of the station or a way out. Finally, he saw the faint glow of the lamppost. Relief surged through him, but as he reached the platform, his heart sank. Another train was waiting, its doors open. It wasn't the train he'd taken earlier. This one was ancient, its windows dark and lifeless, the metal covered in the same strange symbols he'd seen inside the abandoned car. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence was worse than the noise. Ethan turned slowly and saw them, figures emerging from the woods. Dozens of them, all tall and thin, their faces featureless save for the glowing orbs where their eyes should have been. They didn't move, didn't speak, they just watched. The train let out a low whistle, and the doors began to close. Without thinking, Ethan leapt inside, the doors shutting behind him. The train started moving, its wheels screeching against the rusted tracks. As it sped away from the station, Ethan realized he wasn't alone. The figures were there, seated all around him, their glowing eyes fixed on him. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a dim light, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The train plunged into darkness, and Ethan knew he would never reach his destination.
Story number 8.
The train arrived just as the clock struck midnight, a silver streak slicing through the night, its exterior glistening under the pale moonlight. Jonah stepped onto the platform, shivering against the chill that seemed unnatural for the season. The station was deserted, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. He glanced at the train's destination board, which displayed only a blinking, garbled mess of letters. Jonah hesitated. This wasn't the train he had been waiting for, but the platform attendant had assured him that the next train would take him home. The last thing he wanted was to spend the night in this eerie station. With a deep breath, he boarded. The car was pristine, far cleaner than the decrepit platform suggested. The seats were a polished crimson leather, and the air smelled faintly of lavender. Jonah settled into an empty row, glancing around. There were a few other passengers, but something about them felt off. They sat unnaturally still, faces pale and expressionless, their gazes fixed forward as if in a trance. The train jerked forward, and Jonah felt the vibrations beneath his feet as it gained speed. He stared out the window, but the view outside was pitch black, devoid of stars, streetlights, or even the moon. His reflection stared back at him, and for a moment he thought he saw something move behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. As the train sped on, Jonah began to notice subtle changes. The lights flickered occasionally, and the air grew colder. The passengers remained motionless, their unblinking eyes unnerving him more with each passing minute. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but there was no signal, not even a hint of a connection. Next stop, Terminus, the intercom crackled. The voice was garbled, almost inhuman, but Jonah caught the word clearly. He frowned. Terminus wasn't a station he recognized, and it certainly wasn't on his route. He stood and approached the nearest passenger, a man in a dark suit sitting rigidly in his seat. "Excuse me," Jonah said, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you know where this train is going?" The man didn't respond. Jonah leaned closer and realized with a jolt that the man's chest wasn't rising or falling. He wasn't breathing. His skin was waxy, almost plastic-like, and when Jonah touched his shoulder, it was ice cold. Panic set in, and Jonah stumbled backward, bumping into another passenger. This one, a woman in a flowing dress, slumped slightly at the touch, her head lolling to the side. Her eyes stared straight ahead, lifeless and glassy. Jonah rushed toward the front of the car, his heart pounding. The train's hum grew louder, a deep, throbbing sound that reverberated in his skull. He reached the door connecting to the next car and yanked it open, stepping into the narrow corridor. The next car was empty, but it wasn't the pristine, polished space he'd just left. This one was decayed, the seats torn and oozing a dark, viscous fluid. The windows were cracked, and the floor was sticky underfoot. The air reeked of rot and mildew, making Jonah gag. A soft sound caught his attention, a faint, wet scraping noise coming from the far end of the car. He froze, his eyes straining to see through the dim light. A figure was crouched there, its back to him, hunched over something. "Hello?" Jonah called, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stopped. Slowly, it turned its head, revealing a face that was impossibly wrong, its features twisted and grotesque, with a mouth that stretched far too wide and eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. It grinned at him, a smile that sent icy tendrils of fear curling around Jonah's spine. He bolted, slamming through the door into the next car. This one was worse. The walls covered in claw marks and smeared with dark handprints. The windows were gone, replaced by gaping holes that opened into an endless void. Jonah didn't stop to look, running through car after car, each one more distorted and horrifying than the last. Finally, he reached the engine room. The door was ajar, and he shoved it open, desperate to find a way to stop the train. The room was a chaos of gears and levers, none of which made any sense. A figure stood at the controls, its back to him. It wore a conductor's hat, but its body was unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated. "Please," Jonah shouted. "Stop the train!" The figure turned, and Jonah's scream caught in his throat. Its face was featureless, a blank slate of pale skin. It raised a long, spindly arm and pointed past Jonah toward the rear of the train. Jonah turned to see the passengers from the first car standing in the doorway. Their eyes glowed yellow, their expressions twisted into malicious grins. They moved toward him in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural. The conductor reached for a lever, and the train plunged into darkness. Jonah felt the floor disappear beneath him as he fell, the sound of the passengers' laughter echoing in his ears. When he woke, he was back on the platform. The station was silent, the air heavy. The train was gone, but its whistle lingered faintly in the distance. Jonah stood shakily, his body trembling. The clock on the platform struck midnight again, and a silver streak appeared in the distance. The train was coming back.
Story number 9.
The storm had rolled in quicker than expected, and Mia cursed herself for taking the last train of the night. The station she got off at wasn't her usual stop. It was a remote one, a small, unstaffed platform surrounded by dense woods. She'd planned to call a rideshare, but as she stepped out of the train, she realized her phone had no signal. The train pulled away with a haunting screech. leaving Mia alone in the howling wind and rain. The single lamppost on the platform flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that danced along the tree line. She shivered and pulled her coat tighter, scanning for a path that might lead to the main road. Through the downpour, Mia spotted a sign just beyond the platform. It was rusted and barely legible, but it seemed to point toward a dirt trail leading into the woods. With no other option, she decided to follow it. The trail was narrow and slick with mud, the towering trees overhead blocking out what little light the stormy sky provided. Branches cracked and snapped somewhere in the distance, making Mia jump. She told herself it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. As she trudged forward, her shoes squelching in the mud, she became aware of another sound, a faint humming. It wasn't coming from her, and it wasn't the storm. It was distant at first, but grew louder with every step, a low, melodic drone that seemed to vibrate through the air. She stopped and turned, her breath hitching. The path behind her was empty, but the humming persisted, now accompanied by the faintest of whispers. The words were indistinct, a jumble of syllables that made her skin crawl. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. The trail suddenly ended at an overgrown clearing. In the middle stood an old train car, its paint peeling and windows shattered. It looked out of place, as if it had been dropped there by some unseen force. The humming was louder now, emanating from within the train car. Mia's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but curiosity, or perhaps something else, compelled her forward. She climbed the rusted steps and peered inside. The interior was dim, lit by a faint green glow that seemed to come from nowhere. The seats were intact, but covered in a fine layer of dust, and the air was thick with an acrid metallic scent. As she stepped inside, the humming ceased abruptly. The silence was deafening. She moved cautiously down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the empty car. At the far end, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a row of photographs pinned to the wall. They were old, yellowed with age, but one of them was unmistakably of her. Her mind raced. How could her picture be here? She reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed the photograph, the train car lurched violently. The doors slammed shut and the green glow intensified, bathing the entire space in an eerie light. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her. Mia spun around, her eyes darting wildly, but she saw nothing. Then, one by one, the seats began to fill. Figures materialized out of the air, pale, gaunt passengers dressed in clothing from different eras. Their faces were blank, devoid of eyes, mouths, or noses, yet Mia felt their gaze bore into her. "Why are you here?" A voice boomed, deep and resonant, cutting through the cacophony of whispers. Mia couldn't locate the source of the voice. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. She stumbled backward, her hands grasping at the train seats for support. I don't know," she stammered. The train car began to shake violently, and the figures stood in unison, their featureless faces turning toward her. The air grew impossibly cold, and the whispers coalesced into a single chant, repeating words she couldn't understand. "Let me out!" Mia screamed, running toward the door. She pulled at it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the green light engulfed her. For a moment, she felt weightless, as though she were falling. Then, everything went black. When Mia opened her eyes, she was back on the platform. The rain had stopped, and the storm had passed. The train station was empty, silent except for the occasional chirp of crickets. She stood shakily, looking around. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Relief washed over her as she pulled it out and saw she finally had a signal. But when she glanced at the screen, her heart sank. There was a new photo in her gallery, taken from inside the train car. It was of her, standing in the aisle, surrounded by the faceless figures. The last train of the night arrived, its doors sliding open silently. Inside, the seats were pristine, inviting. But Mia didn't move. She stood frozen as the train waited, its engine humming softly, almost expectantly. When the doors finally closed and the train pulled away, she could have sworn she saw those same figures staring at her from the windows.
Story number 10.
The train cut through the foggy countryside like a ghost, its whistle sounding mournful in the stillness of the night. Andrew had been on the train for hours, trying to reach a remote town where his grandmother lived. She had called him earlier that day, her voice trembling with an urgency he hadn't heard before. "Come quickly," she'd said, her words barely audible. "I need to tell you something before it's too late." Andrew hadn't asked questions. Now, as he sat alone in his dimly lit car, he wondered if her fragile mind was playing tricks on her. The train was nearly empty. The only other passenger was an old man in a black coat sitting a few rows ahead. He hadn't moved since the journey began, not even to glance out the window. As the train slowed for its next stop, Andrew stretched his legs and glanced at the window. The glass reflected the interior more than it showed the outside world, but he caught glimpses of tall, gnarled trees and an overgrown platform. The sign for the station was so weathered that the name was illegible. When the train came to a halt, no one got on or off. Andrew leaned into the aisle, curious, but the conductor was nowhere to be seen. Odd, but not alarming, yet. The train started moving again, and Andrew settled back into his seat. But then he noticed something strange. The old man in the black coat had turned around to face him, his pale eyes unblinking. Startled, Andrew offered a nervous smile, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he simply turned back around, his movements jerky, like a poorly wound automaton. Andrew's unease deepened. He decided to find the conductor to ask when they'd reach his stop. He made his way to the adjoining car, but when he opened the door, he froze. The car was empty, completely devoid of seats, lights, or windows. It was just an endless metal tunnel stretching into darkness. A cold draft blew through, carrying a faint, metallic smell that made his stomach churn. Andrew retreated, slamming the door shut. When he turned around, the old man in the black coat was gone. His seat was empty, but his coat still hung over the backrest, swaying gently as if someone had just risen from it. A faint tapping sound began, growing louder. It seemed to come from the roof of the car. Andrew's heart pounded as he looked up, half expecting to see something clawing at the ceiling. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep groaning noise that resonated through the train. The lights flickered, plunging the car into brief moments of darkness. Each time the light returned, the interior of the train seemed to shift subtly. The seats were no longer perfectly aligned, and the walls appeared to be closing in. Andrew ran back to his seat, grabbing his bag. He was done with this train. Whatever was happening, he needed to get off at the next stop. But as he sat down, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The view outside the window had changed. Instead of the foggy countryside, there was now nothing, just an endless black void. The trees, the stars, even the ground were gone. The train was speeding through a vacuum of darkness, with no sign of the world he knew. Panic set in. Andrew rushed to the emergency brake, but when he pulled it, nothing happened. The train kept hurtling forward, its engine roaring louder than ever. He stumbled back to his seat, gripping the armrests as the train began to shake violently. Then the whistle blew, long and shrill, echoing like a scream. The sound was deafening, and Andrew clamped his hands over his ears. When it finally stopped, the train lurched to a halt. The silence was suffocating. The doors hissed open, revealing a platform shrouded in mist. Andrew hesitated, but staying on the train felt far more dangerous. He grabbed his bag and stepped out. The platform was unlike any he'd ever seen. The ground was cracked and uneven, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. A faint light glowed in the distance, illuminating a path that led into the mist. Andrew looked back at the train, but the doors had already closed. Through the windows, he thought he saw shadows moving, but no one had been on the train except him and the old man. Swallowing his fear, Andrew followed the path. The mist thickened, curling around him like smoke. The light ahead grew brighter, but it cast no warmth. When he reached its source, he found himself standing before a massive iron gate, rusted and ornate. Beyond the gate was a cemetery. Rows of headstones stretched into the fog, their inscriptions too worn to read. In the center of the graveyard stood a single figure, cloaked and hooded, holding a lantern that burned with an otherworldly blue flame. "Andrew," the figure said, its voice hollow and echoing. "How do you know my name?" Andrew demanded, his voice shaking. The figure pointed to a gravestone near his feet. Reluctantly, Andrew stepped closer and read the inscription. His breath caught in his throat. It was his name, his full name, along with today's date. Andrew turned to run, but the path behind him was gone. The train had disappeared, and the gate slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the night. The last thing he saw was the lantern's eerie blue glow closing in.